Noel, 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 Noel. Masters in this hall, and hear ye all the news today, brought from oversea, and ever you I pray. Noel, 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 sing we clear, open are all folk on earth, born the Son of God so dear. Noel, 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 sing we loud, God today hath poor folk raised up, and cast down the proud. Noel, 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 Noel. This is Christ the Lord, and masters be glad. Christmas is coming, and no folk should be sad. Noel, 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 sing we clear, open are all folk on earth, born the Son of God so dear. Noel, 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 sing we loud, God today hath poor folk raised up, and cast it down the cast it down the cast it down the cast it down the cast down the proud, cast down the proud.
This story begins just after Queen Victoria came to the throne. Jacob Marley had been dead for 7 years. His business partner, Ebenezer Scrooge, was the meanest man in London. Scrooge was so mean he would not even pay for a coat of paint to remove Marley's name from the office sign. It still read, Scrooge and Marley. It was a cold, foggy Christmas Eve, and a small boy with a bright red nose bent down to the keyhole to sing a carol. Scrooge rushed out with a long wooden ruler to take a crack at the boy's head, but he had scurried off. Scrooge hated Christmas and everything to do with it. He was a mean, close-fisted old miser who never did a kind action or gave a penny away. He looked as if the cold had got right inside him. His thin lips were blue. His nose looked shriveled and nipped. His eyebrows, wiry hair, and stubbly chin looked silver with frost. But his heart was the coldest of all. It made his office chilly, even in summer. At Christmas, the temperature was freezing. He only had one tiny fire and kept the coal bucket by his desk. His clerk could not fetch a fresh piece of coal without asking. His clerk's name was Bob Cratchit. He sat perched on a high stool in the outer office, writing in a huge account book. He wore mittens, but his fingers were so cold he could hardly hold his quill pen. The ink was freezing in his inkwell. He wore a long scarf he called his comforter, wrapped 3 times around his neck for warmth. His wife had knitted it, for Bob could not afford an overcoat. Scrooge only paid him 15 shillings a week. Even Scrooge's name sounded mean. Ebenezer. People were going past in the foggy London streets, coughing and wheezing. The air was smoky, so it was dark, even though it was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Scrooge could hardly see the houses opposite, and candles were lit in all the city offices. Bob Cratchit tried to warm his hands at his candle flame with little success. Although it was so dark and foggy, everyone was cheerful. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and the shops were full of Christmas good cheer and blazing with lights. There were turkeys and geese, piles of oranges and apples, nuts, cakes and sweets, but not everybody had the money to buy them. Suddenly Scrooge's office door opened, and a cheery voice cried, "Merry Christmas, Uncle!" It was Scrooge's nephew, Fred. He was glowing red in the face from walking quickly. His eyes sparkled, and his breath was like smoke in the cold air. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." His nephew laughed. "What reason have you to be miserable? You're rich enough." "Merry Christmas," growled Scrooge. "Down with Christmas. If I had my way, everybody that goes about saying Merry Christmas should be boiled in it with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." "You don't mean that, I'm sure, Uncle. Come and have Christmas dinner with us tomorrow, and let's be friends." But Scrooge refused. "I am going to wish you a Merry Christmas, in spite of your bad temper, Uncle, and a Happy New Year." "Bah! Humbug!" Scrooge snapped at his nephew, went out, with a friendly word to Bob Cratchit as he left. As Fred went out of the door, he stood back to let in 2 plump, pleasant-faced gentlemen. They were collecting money for the poor, to give them a bit of comfort at Christmas time. "Mr. Marley?" asked one of them. "Marley's dead. I'm Scrooge," barked Ebenezer. He refused to give anything to the collection. "Are there no prisons?" he demanded. "Are there no workhouses? I support those with my taxes. Let the poor go there." "Many can't go there, and many would rather die, sir." "Let them die, then," said Scrooge. "There are far too many poor people." The gentleman went away disappointed. The fog got deeper, and the afternoon darker. Soon it was time to shut the office. Bob put out his candle. "I suppose you want the day off tomorrow," grumbled Scrooge. "I shall have to pay you a whole day's wages for no work." "It's only once a year," said Bob timidly. "And that's once too often," growled Scrooge. But he had to let the clerk go. Scrooge ate a lonely supper in a miserable inn and read the financial papers.
God rest you, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day, to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of great comfort and tidings
Scrooge lived alone in a gloomy old house that had belonged to Jacob Marley, his old partner. It was so dark in the yard that Scrooge had to feel his way up to the gatepost. He was putting his key into the door when he noticed the knocker. It was a big old-fashioned one, with nothing special about it. It was not an ordinary knocker at all. It was Marley's face. Marley's face was a dismal shade of green, rather like a bad fish glowing in the dark. Ghostly spectacles were perched on its ghostly forehead, and the hair moved gently as if the breeze were stirring it. Its eyes had a fixed stare. As Scrooge looked hard at it, it turned back into a knocker again. Scrooge was not frightened. He did not believe in ghosts. He entered the house, lit his candle, and looked at the inside of the door. He expected to see the back of Marley's head, but there were only screws and nuts. He closed the door and went up the wide staircase. Was something going up ahead of him? He told himself firmly that Marley had been dead for 7 years. Upstairs, everything was as usual. There was nothing under the bed or under the table. A little saucepan of porridge was on the hob by a small coal fire. Scrooge put on his slippers, his dressing gown and nightcap, and sat down to eat his porridge. But first, he made sure that the door was locked. There were pictures of Bible characters on the tiles around the fireplace. Cain and Abel, the Queen of Sheba, Abraham and Isaac. They all looked like Jacob Marley to him. "Humbug," said Scrooge. Just then a bell high above the fireplace began to swing to and fro. It had not been used for years. Now it began to ring, and every bell in the house rang loudly for about a minute. Then came a clanking noise deep in the house, as if someone were dragging a heavy chain up from the cellar. "It's humbug," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." But the cellar door opened, and the noise came up the stairs, through the heavy door and into the room. Before his very eyes, the flame in the fire leapt up, and it was as if it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost." And there was Marley, wearing his usual waistcoat, tight trousers and boots. The chain around his waist was very long and wound around him like a tail. It was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, account books, and heavy metal purses. Scrooge could see right through his body to the 2 buttons on his coat behind. "You don't believe in me, do you?" said the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "You could be the result of an upset stomach. Perhaps you're an undigested bit of beef or a crumb of cheese." The ghost took no notice of Scrooge's feeble joke. Instead, it gave a frightful cry and rattled its chain. "What is that chain you're wearing?" asked Scrooge.
"I made this chain in life, link by link and yard by yard. You have one too, just as heavy and thick as mine. But you have 7 years more, so yours is much longer."
Scrooge looked down at himself, but could not see anything.
"I only thought about money. I lost so many chances to do good,"
sighed the ghost. "But you were a good businessman, Jacob."
"Business? Human beings were my business. I neglected them, and now I'm being punished for it."
"Why have you come to me?" asked Scrooge.
"To warn you, so that you can escape my fate. You are going to be visited by 3 spirits who will come to you as the church clock strikes 1.
"I'd much rather they didn't," said Scrooge. But the ghost wrapped its tail around its arm and walked backwards towards the window, which began to open wide. The ghost floated out into the night air. Scrooge heard sad cries and saw that the sky was full of figures like Marley. They were crying out sadly and trying to reach the suffering human beings they had not helped while they were alive. Suddenly Scrooge felt very tired. He crept into bed and fell asleep right away. Scrooge woke up with a start when the church bell chimed midnight. Was it a dream, or was a spirit really going to appear to him at 1 o'clock? He lay awake listening until at last the bell boomed out 1. The lights all flashed up in his room, and the curtains on his 4-poster bed were drawn.
There stood a strange small figure, with a smooth face like a child, but with long white hair like an old man. It wore a white tunic and held a branch of holly in its hand. A bright clear light shone from the top of its head. It carried a cap like a fire extinguisher, which you could use to put out this light. "Who or what are you?" asked Scrooge. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, your past." "What brings you here?" "To remind you, to help you. Get up and come with me." Scrooge got out of bed in his nightclothes and took the spirit's hand. They were suddenly in the country, in a small market town. Boys were riding along the road. They were going home for the Christmas holidays. Scrooge knew who they were, his old school friends. He began to cry. He remembered how he had been left behind that Christmas in a cold, cheerless schoolroom, forgotten by everyone. He could see himself as a boy, sitting, reading. Behind him, outside the window, the people in the book came to life, but the pictures faded. He dried his eyes on his sleeve. "I wish," he said. "What?" asked the ghost. "There was a boy singing carols outside my office tonight. I wish I'd given him something." The spirit waved his hand. "Let's look at another Christmas." It was the same schoolroom. The boy was older, alone again. Suddenly the door opened, and a little girl rushed in and hugged him. It was his sister. She'd been sent to bring him home for Christmas. "She was never strong. She died young," said Scrooge. "And left one child, I believe, your nephew." "Yes," said Scrooge thoughtfully. Then they left the school behind and found themselves in a huge city. It was Christmas Eve, and the streets were lit up. They stopped at a warehouse door. "Do you know it?" "Know it? I was apprenticed here," said Scrooge excitedly. There was a jolly party in full swing. Old Fezziwig, Scrooge's employer, was celebrating Christmas with his family and workpeople. There was a splendid supper, a great piece of cold roast, a great piece of cold boiled ham, mince pies, cake, and beer. Best of all, there was a fiddler who played for country dancing. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig were the top couple in Sir Roger de Coverley. Old Fezziwig seemed to be everywhere at once, twinkling with his legs, and Mrs. Fezziwig kept up with him. Scrooge was delighted. He enjoyed it all as much as he had all those years ago. At the end, he looked up at the spirit. "Anything the matter?" "No," said Scrooge. "I just wish I could say a word to my clerk, that's all." The next picture was not so cheerful. Scrooge was older and looked meaner. He was talking with his sweetheart. She told him he cared more about his money than about her, and gave him back his engagement ring. Scrooge was upset. Next, he saw his sweetheart happily married to someone else, while he sat alone in his office with only a candle for company. "Take me away," he cried out, and struggled with the spirit. He tried to press down the cap on the light of memory that shone from its head. Suddenly, he was in his own bedroom. He fell on his bed and sank into a deep sleep.
holly and the ivy, when they are both full grown, of all the trees that are in the wood, the holly bears the crown. The rising of the sun and the running of the deer, the playing of the merry organ, sweet singing in the choir. The holly bears of the sun, as white as the lily flower, and Mary bore sweet Jesus Christ to be our sweet Saviour. The rising of the sun and the running of the deer, the playing of the merry organ, sweet singing in the choir. The holly bears a berry as red as any blood, and Mary bore sweet Jesus Christ for to do us sinners good. The rising of the sun and the running of the deer, the playing of the merry organ, sweet singing in the choir.
The holly bears
a prickle as sharp as any thorn, and Mary bore sweet Jesus Christ on Christmas Day in the morn. The rising of the sun and the running of the deer, the playing of the merry organ, sweet singing in the choir. The holly bears a boy as bitter as any gold, and Mary bore sweet Jesus Christ for to redeem us all. The rising of the sun and the running of the deer, the playing of the merry organ, sweet singing in the choir.
Scrooge woke again with a jump, just as the clock was striking 2. A blaze of light seemed to be coming from the room next door. He heard a voice calling him.
Come in, Scrooge.
He put on his slippers and shuffled to the door. His room looked quite different. It was decorated with holly, ivy, and mistletoe. There was a huge crackling fire in the grate. He heaped up on the floor to make a kind of throne. He saw turkeys, geese, chickens, joints of beef, strings of sausages, mince pies, Christmas puddings, and pyramids of fruit. On top of them sat a jolly giant, holding a torch shaped like a horn of plenty. He held it up to shine its light on Scrooge as he came peering round the door.
Come in, man, and get to know me,
said the giant.
I am the ghost of Christmas present.
Spirit, said Scrooge humbly, I know you have come to do me good. Please take me with you. The spirit took him out into the streets where people were doing their last-minute shopping, getting ready for Christmas. The bells rang out for the services from church and chapel. Poor people who could not afford the fuel to cook at home were carrying their dinners to the baker's shops. The spirit stood in a doorway and sprinkled a few drops from his torch in blessing on these poor folks' dinners. They came to a very small house. It belonged to Bob Cratchit. Scrooge's clerk. He only earned 15 shillings a week, yet the ghost of Christmas present gave his house a special meaning. The Cratchits were all dressed up in honour of Christmas. Mrs. Cratchit and her daughters had shabby dresses, but they had decked them up with gay ribbons. Young Peter was wearing his father's starched wing collar, a lot too big for him, and getting the corners in his mouth. He was sticking a fork into a bubbling saucepan of potatoes, while one of the girls was laying the table. Two excited little Cratchits, a boy and a girl, rushed in to say they were sure they could smell their goose cooking at the baker's. "Where's your father and Tiny Tim?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "Here they come," said the children, and Bob, with 3 feet of comforter around his neck and Tiny Tim on his shoulder, came round the door. Tiny Tim carried a crutch and had an iron frame on his leg. Just then, the young Cratchits came, charging back, bearing the goose on a tray. Mrs. Cratchit hotted up the gravy. Young Peter mashed the potatoes. The girls dished up the applesauce and put out the hot plates. Everyone sat round the table, and Bob said grace. Then Mrs. Cratchit plunged her long carving knife into the breast, and the smell of sage and onion stuffing gushed out. They all said there was never such a tender, tasty goose. There was enough for everybody. The two young Cratchits, who were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows, could have eaten any more anyway. Next, it was the turn of the Christmas pudding, which had been boiling away in the kitchen copper. The room smelled like a wash day and baking day combined. Mrs. Cratchit carried in the pudding, blazing with brandy, with a sprig of holly on top. It looked like a speckled football. No one even dared to hint that it was a rather small pudding for such a big family. Then they all sat around the fire, eating roast chestnuts and drinking Christmas toasts. Bob raised his glass, a custard cup without a handle. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dear. God bless us." And Tiny Tim added, "God bless us, everyone." He sat close to his father, who held his thin little hand. "Spirit," whispered Scrooge, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live."
"I see an empty chair," said the spirit, "and beside it a little crutch. If these shadows do not change, Tiny Tim will not see another Christmas." "But why should you care? Let him die. There are too many poor people."
Scrooge heard his own words and was silent with shame. Suddenly Scrooge heard a jolly laugh. It was Fred, his nephew. They were having a Christmas party. After a hilarious game of blind man's buff, they were playing a guessing game, yes or no. Fred had to think of something you could only answer yes or no to. Yes, he was thinking of an animal, a disagreeable, savage animal. Yes, it lived in London. No, it wasn't in a zoo. No, it wasn't a horse, or a donkey, or a cow, or a tiger, or a cat, or a bear. Scrooge's nephew laughed so much he almost fell off the sofa. At last, his plump sister-in-law squealed out, "I know who it is! It's your Uncle Scrooge!" And so it was. They all drank a toast to Uncle Scrooge, who would have answered them, but the spirit took him away again to see other people's Christmases in distant lands. But gradually the spirit grew smaller
and smaller. Its brown hair turned to grey. "Is your life so short?" asked Scrooge. Then Scrooge noticed something hiding in the folds of the spirit's robe. There were 2 children in there, a boy and a girl, very thin, half-starved and ragged. "These are the children of the world who have no parents and no one to make a Christmas for them," said the spirit sadly. "Have they nowhere to go?" asked Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The clock struck 3. Scrooge looked about him for the spirit, but it was gone. Instead, he saw a solemn figure, clad in a dark hood and cloak, gliding like a mist over the ground towards him. It was the last of the spirits. Spirit did not speak. All Scrooge could see of it in the gloom was one outstretched hand, pointing from its black garments. Scrooge was filled with fear. "Are you the spirit of the future?" he asked, trembling. "Are you going to show me things that are going to happen in the years to come?" The spirit seemed to bend its head.
"Will you not speak to me?" begged Scrooge. Instead, the spirit pointed straight ahead. They were in the city. The businessmen were standing in groups, chinking the gold coins in their pockets. Scrooge and the spirit stopped near enough to hear what some of them were saying. "I don't know much about it. I only know he's dead," said one fat merchant. "Who's he left all his money to?" asked another, taking snuff out of a large snuff box. "I don't know," said a red-faced banker with a wart on his nose. "He hasn't left it to me." They all laughed. "I wonder who'll go to his funeral," said the fat man. He hadn't any friends. Scrooge wondered who they were talking about. He looked about for himself, but he was not in his usual place of business. Next, the spirit took Scrooge to a dreadful slum in the poorest part of London. Under a low roof, there stood a shabby old second-hand shop, full of rubbish. A rag and bone man was crouching by an evil-smelling stove, waiting for customers. Two men and a woman came in out of the murky night, carrying bundles. They had some bedding, clothes, and old curtains for sale. "Where'd you get these, then?" croaked the old rag and bone merchant, picking them over. "The old chap we took them from won't want them again," chuckled the woman. "No, where he's gone, he won't want no sheets or nightshirt," said the other woman. "If he hadn't been such a wicked old screw, he might have had somebody to look after him when he was dying," said the man, throwing down a pair of cufflinks. "It serves him right." Scrooge watched while a few coins changed hands. "Spirited," he said, "doesn't anyone feel sorry for this man's death? Show me someone with some feeling about it." The ghost spread its dark robe out like a wing and then drew it back to show a room where a mother sat with her young children. Then her husband came in, looking ill and worried. Yet there was a look of joy on his face, too. "We have more time to pay our debt," he said. "Has the old man relented, then?" said his wife eagerly. "No," said her husband. "He is dead." The wife's face brightened. This was the only feeling anyone had for the old man's death. It was a relief. Scrooge begged the spirit to show him some kind of feeling connected with the death. For an answer, the spirit took him to Bob Cratchit's house. The little Cratchits were quiet. Their mother was sewing. "Is your father coming?" she said. "He's late." "I think he walked slower in the evenings than he did with Tiny Tim, and he was so light to carry," said their mother. Just then Bob came in, wearing his comforter, and his family hurried to get his tea. He had been to the cemetery. "It's such a lovely place," said Bob. "I promised Tiny Tim we'd go there every Sunday." Bob had met Scrooge's nephew in the street. Fred had told him how sorry he was and asked what he could do to help. "We must never forget Tiny Tim," said Bob to his family. "We must never quarrel with each other, for he was so patient and good." They all hugged and kissed each other and made the promise. "I am very happy," said Bob, looking round at his wife and children. Scrooge said anxiously to the spirit, "Show me myself, as I shall be in the years to come." The spirit took him to his office, but another man sat at his desk. Scrooge began to feel a sense of dread.
The tall black figure led him on, still pointing to an iron gateway. It led to a neglected churchyard, where the grass and nettles had grown high. The spirit stood among the graves, its long finger pointing to one. Scrooge said, "Tell me, Spirit, are these the things that will happen, or are they the things that may happen? Can they not be changed?" But the spirit still pointed at the grave without speaking. On the stone, Scrooge read his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "No, no," he cried, clutching the spirit's robe. "I am not that man. I will not be that man. Isn't there any hope for me? Can I change what you have shown me?" The spirit's hands trembled. "I promise to keep Christmas in my heart all year round. I promise to remember the lessons that the spirits have taught me. Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future. Please tell me I can change the writing on the stone." As he begged the spirit, he saw an alteration in its hood and dress. It shrank, collapsing, and changed into a bedpost.
Starlight is falling.
It was his own bedpost and his own bedroom, and it was his own time ahead to make up for the past. He scrambled out of bed, clutched the bed curtains. They had not been torn down and sold. He put on his clothes, inside out, upside down, anyway, laughing and crying at the same time. "A Merry Christmas to everybody," he shouted. "A Happy New Year to the whole world." Then he heard the church bells ringing. Clash, clash, hammer, ding-dong bell. The fog had cleared away. It was golden sunlight and fresh morning air. He opened the window. "What day is it?" he called out to the young boy in the street below. "What day? Why, it's Christmas Day." He had not lost any time after all. The spirits had shown him all their wonders in one night, and it was still Christmas morning. Scrooge took out some money. "Go down to the butcher's in the next street," he said, "and bring back the biggest turkey in the shop. Yes, that's right. The prize turkey. Get the man to come back with you so I can tell him where to take it, and I'll give you ½ The boy ran off down the street. £1 was a lot of money in those days. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit," he chuckled. "He won't know where it came from. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim." After he had sent the man off with the turkey, he had a good look at the door knocker. "What an honest expression it has. It's a wonderful knocker," he said. After he had shaved and dressed in his best suit, Scrooge went out. He smiled at all the people he met and wished them Merry Christmas, and they returned the greeting. Then he spotted the plump gentleman who had been collecting for the poor. He went up and whispered in his ear. The plump gentleman looked amazed and delighted. "A great many back payments are included in that," Scrooge said. Next, he marched boldly up to his nephew's front door and rang the bell. "It's your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Of course he would. He nearly shook his hand off. They had the most wonderful party, and Scrooge joined in it all. Games, dancing, and singing carols. Next morning, though, he was up early. He wanted to catch Bob Cratchit coming in late to the office. Sure enough, poor Bob tried to sneak in unannounced, quarter of an hour after his usual start time. He got rid of his hat and comforter and jumped on his stool, writing away as if his life depended on it. Scrooge growled at him, pretending to be his old, horrible self. "What do you mean by coming in at this time of day?" he snapped. "I'm very sorry," said Bob meekly. "It's only once a year." "I'm not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer," Scrooge said, giving Bob a dig in the waistcoat, and therefore giving him another dig that pushed him right back into the outer office. "Therefore, I'm about to raise your wages." Bob thought Scrooge had gone mad. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge. "A Merry Christmas than I have given you in many a year, my poor fellow. Make up the fire. Let's have a real blaze, and fetch another bucket of coal. I'll look after your family and help Tiny Tim. And we'll brew up a hot toddy this afternoon to celebrate." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city of London knew, or any other city in the good old world. He saw no more spirits, but it was said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas as well as any other man alive.
May that be true of us all, as Tiny Tim once said. God bless us, everyone.
Thank you.